Today, interestingly, the argument is being reversed. That the decline of vocation in traditionally Christian Western countries is now attributed in part to economic prosperity. That is, vocations decline in inverse proportion to economic prosperity. Of course, there are pockets of exception that buck this trend, especially in places like Eastern Europe. As I pointed out in last week's lecture, in Africa, the current data and statistics show an impressive growth of vocations. Again, to quote the recent African Synod, Africa in recent years has also become very fertile ground for religious vocations, priests, brothers, and sisters, end of quote. Nowadays, we talk about reverse evangelization, whereby religious personnel are now missioned to the global north from the global south for apostolic and missionary purposes. There are some African dioceses that have contractual obligations to supply religious personnel to dioceses in the global north, where there is severe shortages of religious and pastoral personnel. Now, while some analysts in the West have caricatured priests as an endangered species, in Africa, the church is enjoying a vocation boom, which is what I talked about last week as well, and some writers have called it the Southern boom. And to quote another writer on this matter, John Allen, began Memorial Seminary in southeastern Nigeria with an enrollment of over 1,100 seminarians. It's said to be the largest Catholic seminary in the world. Its student population by far, by itself, is roughly 1/5 of the total number of seminarians in the United States, end of quote. Here, as in the previous trend that I just spoke about, there are issues that I believe are overlooked and therefore not subject to open and critical debate and dialogue. I would like to state that the growth in vocations should not be a reason for the church in the South to gloat. We have a saying in Eastern Africa that the firewood in the store does not laugh at the firewood in the fire. There are questions that need to be asked in this context. And one of which is whether we suppose this boom in vocation to be a timeless grace of God. Or is it a time-bound sociological trend and a contextual phenomenon that will peak in due course, just as it has in other parts of the church in the world? Assuming that the demographics of change are never static, would there come a time when this bubble of vocation will eventually burst? And if so, what implications would that have for the institution and practice of ordained ministry in the church in Africa? What alternative models are available to the church in terms of how ministry is exercised? What new key roles should the laity assume as collaborators in ministerial functions in the church? Something which the recent African Synod strongly recommended. We could wait for this change to happen before we envisage possibilities and alternatives to the present structure and understanding of ministry. And I honestly believe that that will not be advisable. I see the growing number of lay women and men who are theologically trained as an important resource for and in the church in Africa. Even though, sadly, this trend is still often perceived as a threat in the context of patriarchal conceptions and practices of leadership, authority, and ministry. Another trend connected with the first, and it has to do with the uses and abuses of culture. In my opinion, no word has been used and abused relentlessly as the word culture, particularly when used to argue in favor of so-called timeless truths and unchanging traditions, the way we've always done it. In the age of enculturation, the uncritical and selective use of culture could undermine the credibility of our theological scholarship and conversation. I want to apply this to a particular aspect of ministry in the church. One of the unique features of priesthood in the Roman Catholic tradition is the discipline of celibacy. Now, despite an official gag order on the theological discussion of this requirement, increasingly I hear conversations that raise questions about the relevance and the meaning of this discipline in the context of African cultures. Sometimes the intensity of debate around this question extinguishes completely clear and objective reasoning. And yet I believe we need to face the question. We need to talk about it. I'd like to digress a bit. A priest colleague of mine once told me that in one Eastern African country, a catechist translated the bishop's awkward attempt to explain the meaning of celibacy to an incredulous rural audience as meaning that, I quote, "we have secret wives." End of quote. Sounds funny, but there is a problem here. In some parts of the continent, we don't even have the word to talk about issues such as celibacy. I don't have the word in my own language to talk about it. So we need to talk about it. My mother is a 70-year-old faithful and devout Catholic. She has no formal theological training or background, but without any crisis of conscience, she would engage very readily in a conversation about the value and relevance of celibacy as a constituent element of ordained ministry in Africa. And recently, and I mean as recently as 2 days ago, she expressed her wish to see me married and raising my own children.